Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I'm going to talk about, well, rather continue kind of a previous topic I'd had in the past, and that was reboot/remakes. And more particular, when is it too soon to be doing a reboot/remake? I kind of brought this up, I think, a little bit with the previous video when I was using Spider-Man Homecoming, for example. Like, obviously, when it comes to the Spider-Man movies in general, the live-action movies, there's been a shorter and shorter amount of time in between reboots. Obviously, from like the Tobey Maguire ones to the Andrew Garfield ones, it was like 2006 for Spider-Man 3 to 2012 for the first Amazing Spider-Man, so that was 6 years. And then technically 2 years between the Amazing Spider-Man 2, which was in 2014, and Spider-Man popping up in Civil War, which came out 2016. So it's even smaller frame because you also have to put in time for production and stuff like that. But if you were to go purely by the fact of the matter is Homecoming's release, then it's 3 years. So it's a shorter and shorter time span. And that in itself is kind of an interesting conversation. Obviously, previously I brought up the fact of the matter is if you've never seen the previous material, a remake is always nice because it might be for some people who are like, yeah, because certain movies don't age well just because it's like you didn't have the technology that you have access to today, so certain things don't hold up. That doesn't mean everything doesn't. There are plenty of movies where people are like, no, the practical effects for this movie still hold up. I mean, because this applies both on TV shows and movies. Like TV show wise, the most recent reboot is the Charmed reboot. That show, I talked about it previously when I brought up my discussion about the Charmed TV show being rebooted. Charmed started 20 years ago. The show ended 12 years ago in 2006. So it's like, it's been a 12-year period. So it's like, I think that's enough wiggle room to make a reboot or remake. I mean, to be fair, like also on that same front, I guess technically make the argument that the Flash TV show technically is one because there is a Flash TV show that came out in the 90s, which I had no idea about. So it's another thing of like, oh yeah, I'm glad that there is a more modern live action take on this character. And then look at, you know, the movie fronts. Obviously, I used the example of Spider-Man. I mean, kind of on the other side of things, like you have the Hellboy thing, and that in itself is kind of a sad situation just because it's like, you know, I recently heard Ron Perlman kind of talk about it. I never previously looked into it, but I think it was on Collider podcast. He had talked about it, like he wishes them all the luck, he just wishes them well, but it's just like it hurts a little because it's such a fresh wound for him because him and others, I think him and Guillermo del Toro, like spent so much time trying to get a third movie made in the Hellboy movie trilogy, and it was just kind of like it never panned out for like different reasons and stuff like that. And now they kind of rebooted it, and it's kind of like it's just a passion project. It's something I've heard Andrew Garfield kind of feels the same way about Spider-Man, the Amazing Spider-Man situation, which, you know, is like I don't comment on too much because I don't know too much about how he's really, like I've seen clips of how he's talked about it, but even that's got to be kind of like a dagger to the heart because it's like that character and its stories are so important to him because he grew up loving Spider-Man. So it's that thing of kind of like the sad reality of kind of like a reboot in that regard, because those are things that were never finished up. It's just kind of like, yeah, you don't get the chance to kind of finish out the arcs you were trying to create. Whereas it's something like, you know, like a Charmed or something like that, where it's like, oh yeah, it was a show that it started and finished, and now we're kind of bringing it to a new generation, doing our own thing with it, you know? So, I mean, because the whole conversation, because I was bringing it up earlier, and I guess to kind of dive more specifically in that, the only genre I feel like that gets rebooted that often are comic books. Nothing else gets as rebooted as all. To be fair, comic books kind of get rebooted every couple years. It kind of feels a lot more often, but I guess that's just because certain runs of certain characters in a comic book universe will be done and someone else will pick it up, so those characters kind of get rebooted, but the universes themselves get rebooted probably every couple years. So, I mean, to be fair, I think people have always explained to me that like the reasoning for that is just because that way it's always easier for people to jump into comic books at any time. But the sad part about that is it's like when something's getting rebooted like that all the time, it's like when you find a good run of something you really like, it's like, what's the point? It's just going to get like rebooted when the universe gets rebooted or when someone else picks this character up and kind of does their own thing with it. So that's always the interesting thing with that. I mean, I don't know 100% how comic books run, but like obviously some comic books are kind of, you know, obviously their own package deal where it's like their run is their run. It's a complete story, so it's kind of like this complete story and run by this particular artist or writer is always going to be its thing. Whereas like other things, it's like, oh yeah, the continuity from this is completely retcon just because like someone else is now taking it so that it does this and this character does that, so on and so forth. And obviously that, as I was explaining earlier, that obviously reflects into movies and stuff like that too. Other than Spider-Man, I know Hulk has been rebooted quite a bit. It's interesting when you go from like Eric Bana in Hulk to like Edward Norton in Incredible Hulk, and then like Mark Ruffalo in the MCU, which is interesting considering the whole Ed Norton and Mark Ruffalo situation. Well, for one, between Hulk and the Incredible Hulk, like from Eric Bana to Edward Norton, that was like a 4-year period, but then from like another 4 years between the Incredible Hulk and Avengers, which the point I was about to make is, does that really technically count as a reboot because it's a different actor, but technically that's the same continuity? So it's kind of more a continuation rather than a reboot, but I guess it technically is, because not everything from that movie has carryover, but some of the stuff has, because technically, even with the whole Universal situation, that movie still falls under the umbrella of the MCU, so it's just kind of an interesting example in itself. And even take Spider-Man, even outside of the movies, like the animated series, like in my lifetime, there's been multiple iterations and adaptations of Spider-Man in different rebooted kind of cartoons. Like there was a 90s Spider-Man cartoon on Fox, then immediately after that was done some years later, there was Spider-Man Unlimited, which was short-lived, and then there was like the CGI animated one on MTV, then there was Spectacular Spider-Man, and then there was Ultimate Spider-Man, and then now there's Marvel's Spider-Man. It's like, that's 6 iterations of a cartoon, which, you know, kind of do their own thing while kind of also being similar. So, like I said, superhero genre in general is very interesting when it comes to the whole reboot discussion. I mean, even when it comes to video games, the only reboot, and because this discussion kind of has come up recently, is the whole DMC situation, like Devil May Cry. Devil May Cry went from Devil May Cry 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then Ninja Theory got it in like 2013, and released a reboot, DMC Devil May Cry. But as we know, Devil May Cry is now coming back as DMC 5 with a, you know, continuation of the original continuity, which is a weird thing. I forgot who it was. I was like, the Super Best Friends came up with a term for it, like an unboot. I forgot what it was actually called, but it's like undoing a reboot. That reboot still exists out there, but it doesn't count anymore. It's been retconned, which I always kind of feel kind of bad about, because I liked a lot of the aspects. I know general people didn't like I said, people can have their respective reasons why they didn't enjoy the reboot for the specific reasons, the way the character was, the world, whatever the case may be. If it wasn't Dante and it was someone else entirely, if it wasn't a Devil May Cry game, as I've heard most people say, then they would have been perfectly fine with it. But because it was a Devil May Cry game, the name Devil May Cry was associated. They took a lot of aspects from Devil May Cry and put it in this world that people didn't like, and these iterations of the characters that they didn't like. We would never get to see a continuation of that continuity, which, as someone who recently just replayed the game, I'm kind of like, I kind of would love to have seen where they went with this continuity going forward. Just like I said, I like the world and aspect of like Dante and Virgil being half angel, half demon, rather than being half human, half demon in the original continuity. It's kind of interesting because I've been talking mainly reboots. There's also remakes too, because it's like, recently I was hearing that LeBron James is trying to get a Friday the 13th movie, well, Reboots made, which is interesting because and this kind of hits both on like the horror franchise, where it's like Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street both got like rebooted in 2009. In particular, I brought up the Friday the 13th reboot because Jared Padalecki from Supernatural, who played, you know, Sam, he was in it. Also, Danielle Panavicker. I feel like if I go back and I'm like, oh, so-and-so was in that too, but those are the two that kind of come to my mind first, but nothing ever kind of came about like rebooting that franchise. You take Halloween, geez, I almost let that slip my mind. That's a whole thing in itself, where it's like there were multiple Halloween movies, and then it was rebooted by Rob Zombie, and then like I think those movies came out like 2 years apart from each other. It might be more, I don't remember. And now they've subsequently rebooted it, going back to the original continuity. So it's not video game wise, but a movie now has done that, where it's like, oh yeah, like literally after the first Halloween movie, none of that continuity from like Halloween 2 and the first bunch all the way to the reboots done by Rob Zombie, all of that has been erased now, and it's like this is technically Halloween 2, I think. There were continuations, but also like, you know, like I said, this is like the second time it's been rebooted in such a short amount of time, so hence what kind of plays an interesting part in the whole conversation of reboots and stuff like that. But getting back to what I was saying about Friday the 13th, that was in 2009 the reboot came out, so it's you know, 9 years later, so is that too soon? Is that still fresh in people's minds? Because it also turns into that issue when you're making reboots. It's like, you have to give something a subtitle. Even Spider-Man, it's like, oh, Spider-Man, it's not Spider-Man 1 Homecoming, it's just simply Spider-Man Homecoming. Because if you use one, it, you know, you're better off just using subtitles, because like, well, look at The Amazing Spider-Man, it had a way of distinctioning itself. But there's also the whole thing of like, you probably wouldn't be able to use a lot of these subtitles from the Spider-Man like comic books and stuff, because like Ultimate and Spectacular, because those already exist when it comes to animation. So it'd probably be harder to kind of swing that in movie-wise. I don't know. That ultimately comes down to what the MCU wants to do with that whole situation. Ultimately, you know, this is me just rambling on, talking about my opinions and thoughts about the whole situation. Obviously, going back to the original question of like, how do you feel about reboots and remakes in general? But also, let me know, what do you think is the appropriate time frame to do a reboot or a remake? Like, especially something that's like a horror franchise, or even using a video game franchise, for example, where it's like there were multiple titles in it and then you reboot it, the whole naming convention, that whole situation, using the Halloween situation as an example, or like using the Friday the 13th. Like, how do you go about it? Like, you know, is subtitles enough of a thing for you to kind of satisfy that in your head? And also, is the timing framing okay? Like, does it depend on when the franchise started before you rebooted it? Or is it like, when was the last movie? Like, does it have to be a bigger point in time between the previous movie and the reboot? Or is it okay for there to be a small frame of time, just because it's like, okay, let's undo a lot of this other continuity that was created? Is it, you know, because it's like, some of it's kind of like, especially first movies tend to be like origin stories, but it's like, no, we already know the origins. Hence, like the whole Spider-Man situation in the MCU, is like, we don't have to go over the origins because you literally already saw it a few years beforehand, twice actually. So let's not redo that. So like, you know, I'm curious to get your thoughts about all that. I'm going to stop my rambling now. So let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. But really, that's all I wanted to talk about in this video. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.